All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Like I mentioned at the beginning, to fill the empty noise space, I'm Adam Koeppel. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of Agrology. I'm joined today with Kevin Kelly, who is our head of AI and is also one of the founders of Agrology. And we're excited to talk about Net Ecosystem Exchange. And we'll dive right in. Can we go to the next slide, please? So quickly, for housekeeping, please keep yourself on mute. You probably all are defaulted to mute anyways, but please stay that way for now. As you have questions, throw them into the chat so we can track them and make sure we get to them as at the end of the session. And then finally, we'll be doing a recording and the deck itself will all be sent out afterwards. So don't stress out about notes or screen captures, anything like that. We'll make sure to get you all the relevant materials. So today we're talking about net ecosystem exchange, carbon flow, and carbon flux. And we'll start off with some quick definitions. So first of all, it's really important to track carbon across ecosystems because it's essentially the currency of the ecosystem that's powering all the biological processes. And as we track its formation in the soil, we can understand how the soil is improving. We can understand how biomass is growing, and it's a really key metric for the health of the ecosystem. So we look at this from the perspective, typically at Agrology, of agriculture and how monitoring carbon flux can help our customers understand their farming practices and the effects of those farming practices on ecosystem regeneration. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is understanding net ecosystem exchange, which is the net exchange of carbon in and out of the ecosystem, the soil, and the biomass above ground. And so this is a critical way to understand, is the land that you're looking at, is that ecosystem that you're looking at, is it a net source or sink of carbon dioxide? And how is that affecting the atmosphere, from the local level all the way up to the global level? And this is a critical measurement that's been really challenging to achieve historically, and we can talk about why and how it's been done. Next slide, please. So there's a few approaches to quantify net ecosystem exchange, and it'd be wrong of me to not mention that all of these are technically estimates. We'll never know it precisely because it's just frankly hard to measure, but we can get pretty close. And so the gold standard approach is the eddy tower pictured here on the left, an eddy covariance tower, which is a fun combination of micrometeorological measurements and computation to measure vortexes flowing around and essentially to measure how much carbon's going up and how much carbon's going down. Then we have our agrology system, which we're going to be talking about today and how we cross-validate it, that uses machine learning instead of a physics-based approach to do something very similar to an eddy tower. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the canopy chamber, which is basically a large soil chamber that's clear that can cover soil and a canopy and provide a small-scale net ecosystem exchange measurement. There are, of course, things that are not pictured here, like models, which are not really a quantification approach, or remote sensing, and again, an approach that typically requires extensive ground truthing to be valid. So we're really looking at direct measurement approaches here today. Next slide, please. So for measuring NEE, EC towers are the widely accepted gold standard. They quantify the fluxes continuously by looking at the covariance of vertical wind velocity and carbon dioxide concentration. So a way to simplify that is to say, what's the concentration of carbon dioxide in air moving up versus sideways versus down? And they provide a nice large footprint. So that's a really critical thing that you can actually measure a large area. They can be deployed for long terms and run fairly autonomously, so they can capture both diurnal, daily, and seasonal variations in carbon fluxes. And overall, like a really fantastic approach and critical to understanding carbon fluxes in natural and man-managed, human-managed ecosystems. The cons are pretty straightforward. They're pretty pricey. They're expensive pieces of capital equipment. They're operationally complex to run. You need to sometimes have power supplies. You need to site them in a way they won't get damaged by equipment. You need people to maintain them. And they rely on idealized site conditions, hoping that there's not, a ton of terrain effects around there. And then, I should also mention that they can require a fair amount of post-processing of data afterwards, and they can experience dropouts when there's low periods of wind speed. So, and then maybe a final con we'll mention, just because we've noticed this, There's the idealized vision of the Eddy Tower, which we see on the left here, and then kind of the frequent reality where they're a little bit complex to operate, especially after you've been running them for a few years or maybe adding on other equipment. All right, next slide. So next up, I want to talk about the canopy chamber because it's a fun thing. So these measure flux using the chamber method at larger scale. So it's essentially a large PV equals nRT calculation. A great thing here is that you're including canopy absorption instead of just that soil respiration. So you can understand how much the canopy is absorbing versus the soil respiring. And you got some good precision here as a result. It's a simple calculation across a small area with precision sensors. So we got some nice precision over a small area. The cons are these are still basically do-it-yourself devices. You have to build them. There's not a commercial or scale approach. They're operationally pretty complex because you're essentially putting a tent or a greenhouse into a field. They're mechanically complex because they have to open and close. They often have pretty high power consumption for things like fans and their actuators. The area they measure is small, so you can never be sure if it's representative. There's certainly some sort of a chamber effect happening with them. There hasn't been much study of that chamber effect, so it's hard to quantify. And then, of course, there's definitely a greenhouse effect that even as they open and close, there's still a glass enclosure that's likely going to increase photosynthesis and also soil metabolic rates as temperatures rise. So some challenges here too. And I should also take a second to say that, of course, you can never measure anything without affecting the system you're measuring. So that's just going to be a given in all these scenarios. All right, next slide, please. So what we worked on here that we want to share today is we took the Agrology arbiter system for net ecosystem exchange, and we did some cross-validation of it with eddy covariance systems as the gold standard. And we are pre-releasing an article as we prepare to get it ready for publication. And we're excited to share this out here and the results we have today because this is a new approach to NEE, and it lets potentially many more people deploy NEE measurements across human-managed and natural ecosystems, which is really exciting. So we want to talk about our approach, how we cross-validated it, and what we think we can do going into the future. Next slide, please. So just for a little bit of setup here, we did this study across a number of sites. We deliberately wanted to pick a variety of geographies, soils, crops, and even cropping systems so that we could try and get a very diverse data set for really good cross-validation. We've seen, one of the challenges in cross-validating novel approaches is often people focus on a small area, maybe, one soil type and one crop, and that's not necessarily representative of the world at large. And so we did try to pick a number of sites based on where we could get access to sites and access to eddy covariance data. And so those sites range from Stuttgart, Arkansas to a number of different sites across California, ranging from some lovely flood irrigated corn fields in the Central Valley out to some really nice places in wine country. So a range of annual and permanent crops and a range of soils and cropping systems. Next slide, please. So the materials we use for this, of course, if we're doing cross validation, we need to go and actually talk about what we're cross-validating against. We worked against a fairly standard light-core eddy covariance flux tower system that includes 10 hertz measurement of wind frequency, real-time data processing, and corrections. We took the data stock from our scientific and academic partners. We did not do any post-processing ourselves. Frankly, our team does not have the expertise to do it, so we didn't want to try and do anything where we could influence it. But we went to places where these towers had been operating well in agricultural ecosystems, and we could co-locate for the purposes of cross-validation. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we also deployed our devices, as I mentioned. So the Agrology Arbiter device consists of a number of components I'll go over real quick. A critical component is the autonomous and continuously vented soil chamber that measures carbon flux from the soil. It's robust and reliable because it has a continuous passive venting system that doesn't need to open and close. It's small, so it can go into crop rows, and it does not disturb a large amount of soil. And it continuously measures with an NDIR CO2 sensor. sorry, one more second here. Additionally, it includes soil sensors that measure a range of soil parameters, which is great because these soil parameters have a significant effect on fluxes. There's also ground level and canopy level CO2 sensors to get a sense of ambient CO2 conditions, canopy absorption, and then some other interesting parameters that we're still incorporating into our net ecosystem exchange measurements, like air temperatures, humidities, volatile organic compounds, and so forth. So a range of data sources, none requiring the kind of expensive instrumentation that an eddy covariance tower needs, but all measuring things influenced by soil respiration and biological activity in the canopy. Next slide, please. All right, and at this point, I get to hand over the talking portion to Kevin Kelly, who can talk about how, after we ingested all of this data, we developed the approach and the cross validation.
Yeah, and I'll just thank you, Adam. I'll just add one more thing to the previous slide. When we approached this sort of idea that we could synthesize an NEE model, a carbon net ecosystem exchange model that had comparable accuracy to the gold standard EC towers that are deployed, we kind of decided, like, well, let's just throw the kitchen sink at it, right? We're going to throw all of these sensors that we already have installed because they're part of our other product line, the Sentinel. Because honestly, we don't know which features are going to be the most attributable to having a high accuracy model. And I'll say with our current model, we don't even actually use all of those because it helps the model to only use the ones that contribute the most to the model accuracy. But nonetheless, we're collecting all this data. It can always be used for future models, future applications. And it's just a matter of picking and choosing and rerunning a model at a later date. So jumping into the results. So we this is our site number one, and right off the bat, this is like our best performing site. And at first, it was a little bit of a head scratcher, is like what was special about this site in particular. But we'll get more on that later. But suffice to say, what ultimately was the biggest determining factor is the large variance we saw in this data set. It just had the largest positive and negative fluxes across the board. And so we kind of like, we'll put a pin in that. That's kind of interesting. And so let's look at the results of our other sites. So next slide. And here again, we see slightly lower performance here, an R squared of 0.67 as opposed to the I believe it was 7.8 for the previous slide. And if you look at the variances, well, we see proportionally smaller variances that give us different results. So, but still pretty good performance. So again, this is our first iteration of this model. This is more of a learning session for us to see what is a contributing factor. And there are, tons to be considered, from input variables to, just how the device is physically installed and, where it is in relation to the EC tower. So again, this site we're happy with the performance at this site. So moving on to the next site. Here we get into what I would say is probably more of the median variance that we've seen across our sites. So much smaller than the first two sites. But again, as with all of our sites, we see that general trend of the arbiter's flux calculations, actually very closely following the trend of the eddy tower. With the exception of it kind of misses those high frequency spikes. And so that could be, attributable to a number of different things. It could be the hysteresis of the input features themselves. Sometimes soil moisture will lag behind air temperature, and there becomes a non-linear relationship between these things that we need to later extract and understand and do some feature engineering to properly understand those relationships. And or it could just be a factor of we just need more training data. But again, just for our first stab at this, an R squared of over 0.5, we were generally pretty happy with, and is only a good framework to expand upon in 2025. So next slide. And here's our worst slide. Here's our worst performing site. As far as the actual R squared value is concerned, 0.34, we're not thrilled with that. But when we start to look into the data, not only is this a very small variant site, we started noticing other kind of anomalies that are worth exploring going forward, such as the actual install location. We realized for this site, we did not install it downwind of the prevailing winds, downwind of the EC tower. And so, these are all things we're considering, and we're going to take into consideration and try and figure out if there's ways we can retroactively account for these anomalies. But again, these are all just learning data. So next site, 3.3. Similar results here. Again, small variances, low performance, not much else to say. So let's move on to I think it's okay, so there's one more of the validation data set. And again, this is in more of the middle of the pack. So again, the variance is more middle of the road, and we get a score to accompany that. And then next slide. And so here's maybe the most interesting site. So this is a site that was previously completely unseen by the training data set. And by that, I mean the previous slides, the previous data sets I just showed you, we basically took the first 80% chronologically of the data from that site, and that's what we trained our model on. And including in that was some test data to give feedback to the model. And so this is only looking at the validation data was only looking at the last 20% of those previously seen sites. This site in particular was completely unseen. It was set aside to see like, well, what if we take our model and take it to a brand new site, install it, what would we expect to see? And given the low performance of some of the sites in the training data set, I thought maybe it wouldn't be any better than maybe our worst site. But surprisingly, we have an R squared of 0.57 here, which is, pretty respectable. Again, given we only had 6 training data sites, and only a handful of different crop types. So we're pretty emboldened with this, and I think it goes to show that we have broad applicability to new training sites and new install sites. But again, that's what we're aiming to discover as part of this beta. And so next slide. Okay, so the overall findings. Our validation demonstrates that we have the ability to deploy accurate carbon flux models across diverse sites, a diverse install location. The model performs better in high variance locations, but it generalizes well enough to give us an overall R squared of 0.71. And again, it's when we combine all of our validation data sets, it's those large variance outliers, not outliers, those large variance values that are contributing most to our actual score. And our model just doesn't require site-specific validation. We can have respectable results straight out of the box, which will only get better with time and more training data. Next slide. And so what do we want to achieve in 2025? Well, there's multiple opportunities here. The two obvious ones are we want to improve the quality of our data. So we need to standardize our install locations relative to ET towers in the prevailing winds. Um, we just need more training data across multiple months and years to come. And we need more diverse training environments with different crop types and soil types. Um, and then the other obvious improvement would be in the model itself. So as we've seen, we have room for improvement on those low amplitude, those low variance conditions. And we can do that with, simply another model architecture, or an ensemble of model architectures. So say we keep the model we have, but only for fluxes above a certain value. And then we create another model that responds better to the lower ends, and putting them together, we can get the best of both worlds. Um, and then, like I mentioned before, we need to do a better job at capturing the nonlinear relationships and the hysteresis of some of these input features. And that's all something we can do um, through experimentation, through training new models. And once we have something we like, we can go back and just recalculate the fluxes we've had for all the way back since we started this work. And we can give that added accuracy and those added benefits to all of our customers and partners, um, indefinitely. And then on this side, we just have like a high level of our system architecture. So of course, on the left there, we have the arbiter itself deployed. I believe that is in one of our Texas sites, in a cornfield, or sorry, cotton field. And so those devices, as well as our Sentinels, they're measuring continuously, but they uplink every 30 minutes to the Agrology cloud. And that's where we do all our, pre-processing, model queue ups and model prediction runs, as well as model training. And then, we write that all to a SQL database that is fed to our API. And for our customers, we have two very nice clients. We have the grower portal here. Excuse me. And that's a really nice client that we've come out with in the past year or two, I believe. And we also have the mobile app, the Agrology mobile app, that has the benefit of caching all the data. So if you have internet now, but you're about to go out in the field, you can cache all the data and you can do all of your data analysis later in the field without cell service if need be. And then finally, we have our API, which, particularly our research partners are very interested in and have been using a lot. You can access it. You can get a CSV of the raw data and the process data alike. And with that, I believe I'm handing it back to Adam. Oh, Adam's answering some questions here.
Yeah, let me restart my video here. I didn't want my, extraordinary good looks to distract from your presentation, Kevin. So I
appreciate that.
That's not true. Actually, was eating almonds because I was hungry, probably grown on one of the sites we were monitoring, and I can tell you that the regenerative ones tasted better. So to conclude here, I want to go ahead and say the following things that we're really excited about releasing Net Ecosystem Exchange as a beta for our customers, providing these real-time insights into these carbon flows and fluxes and letting our customers connect them to their cultivation practices and kind of close the analytical loop on the changes they're making in land management to the outcomes in carbon flows is really exciting. We can provide feedback to our customers on how their cultivation practices are changing their soil health and their carbon fluxes very, very quickly instead of waiting years for results to show up on soil tests. Uh, this product is a great way to look at soil microbial activity to understand, are you, we can see changes often in a period of weeks after installation and practice changes because the microbiome responds very quickly to changes, and the sensitivity of these devices can capture that. They're cost effective and scalable, which is awesome. I personally have installed a dozen in a couple hours on some cornfields on a cold Iowa morning, and the rest of the team is capable of doing it as well, along with a number of our customers are self-servicing them, which is great. And we're looking to help our customers fill in the gaps of traditional estimate and model-based MMRV approaches. We are, hoping that more people can get quality ground truth data to guide their decision making and capture value. So, down the road, we think that this will let our customers create a new class of environmental assets to track the value of their soil quality in their land as it changes over time, and include that in land value, and just overall value the outcomes of their regenerative transition better. And as time goes on, we'll deliver more accuracy, and we can always back calculate that. We are working on a new version of this of the hardware set that will include all the capabilities we built NEE on, plus some new ones to improve accuracy further, since there's also options in hardware to enhance. And then finally, we're looking to help beyond the agricultural community, anybody studying net ecosystem exchange or planetary sciences to understand carbon flows better, test out approaches to removal with nature-based solutions, and support just global science and carbon mitigation efforts. And I believe this is the last slide. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Oh, nope, of course, the get in touch slide. So a reminder, we'll be sending out the link to this webinar recording, the slides themselves, and the actual pre-print paper to all participants today so that they can read through it, pepper us with questions, and we can hopefully answer them. And if you're interested in learning more about this offering, get you up and running in the near term. So at this point, I'm going to go and see what questions we haven't answered and work through them with Kevin. So let's see, we covered a few as we were going here. We had a first question here about how often you need to get the calculation. Your net ecosystem exchange, we can look at every 30 minutes what's happening roughly, but that doesn't provide the best picture. We've seen, especially in healthy soil environments, that across a few hours there'll be outflows and inflows of carbon to the ecosystem that can be pretty dramatic. And so the best approach is to do some kind of summarization over days. But it is really nice to be able to see those small intervals to understand like what happens in the morning as photosynthesis initiates, what happens in the evening as photosynthesis terminates, and we start to see CO2 accumulation at the ground level. These trends are really excellent to see to understand the biological system more, and there's probably some really interesting discoveries hidden in those data sets. Next up, once you have the results, how often after that you need to keep doing it. So the thing about results here is it depends on what you define as results. A lot of our customers, they're studying this over periods of years of regenerative transition or years of experimentation with new approaches to reducing carbon intensity, improving soil health, and that sort of thing. So they're typically measuring multi-year projects. If you wanted to measure one field or one place for 1 year, you certainly could do that. But the goal here is often continuous measurement to ensure that the ecosystem is performing as expected, that interventions to remove carbon are performing, that interventions to improve soil health are delivering, and that the project is overall on track. When we look at the kind of scale of costs of regenerative transition, this measurement and verification and data acquisition is a very small line item compared to the cultivation cost changes. And so it's a great way to have certainty that the projects are worthwhile and to report on their outcomes. And we've seen, a number of our customers in the agricultural sector are starting to incorporate the data that we are delivering into their annual reporting on sustainability and outcomes. And their purchasers, the supply chain, is really excited to see hard data that backs up regenerative claims, scope 3 reductions, and that sort of thing. And so we encourage people to keep doing that, not just because we have a self-interest in the business, but because the ultimate goal here is to move beyond practice changes to data-based outcomes. Now, next up was a question about Wi-Fi availability. how much data is housed. The data is always streaming, so we don't stash data on the devices. It's always streaming to the cloud today via a LoRaWAN infrastructure with gateways that accumulate the data and move it to the cellular network. And later on this year, via a global cellular and satellite approach that will be operable everywhere. Um, Coming along here, next questions. We had a question about pricing. We'd encourage you to get in touch with our team if you're interested. Pricing is roughly $2,000 to $3,000 per device per year for the lease, for the license for the technology, including the hardware. And at the stage, typically installation, there's some infrastructure costs that can affect that a bit. So we kind of have to see if if you want us to install more devices in the parts of California where we have a lot of customers, it can be a little cheaper than saying, hey, we're measuring the changes in permafrost on carbon emissions on the tundra in Alaska. That's gonna be a little different because delivery can get complicated. So please get in touch. We're happy to talk to everyone. We have devices deployed from Puerto Rico up to Canada, and we're getting ready to deploy in Asia and Australia. So next up, we have a good question for Kevin, which is how do you decide how many observations to include in the regressions?
I just responded to that, but I'll just say the training data set was the growing season of 2024, which is what we defined as roughly March through September, just to be set all things equal. And so the validation regressions include it would be the last 20% of that. So I don't know what 20% of 6 months is, but August, September timeframe.
All
And there
right.
are some, I would just say there's for some there are more data outages than others. So we had fewer validation data points.
Yeah, excellent. So next up, I have the question of how do you evaluate the sensor on stable atmospheric conditions? I threw an answer in the chat, but I'll go in a little more details here, as this is an excellent question. Stable atmospheric conditions are super challenging because that's one of the primary cases when you have dropouts and eddy covariance measurements. The arbiter devices themselves include ambient concentration sensors and soil chambers so they can track photosynthetic activity and soil respiration even when there is no wind movement, no vortex happening, totally stable atmospheric conditions. And one of the key things that's causing, the a lower than ideal R squared value is that we don't know how to handle these dropout periods and when we are potentially more accurate than the eddy covariance approach. And so this is something that's going to require more study and more evaluation. But we can assume that the sensors, especially soil respiration, are quite accurate in stable atmospheric conditions. We just have to figure out how to work with eddy covariance data as accurate as possibly to adjust. And so eventually what we'll do is we'll account for that in the algorithms to like Kevin said, to bias towards maybe our measurements more during those periods of stable atmosphere with low atmospheric movement. And we're also, of course, open to collaborating with anybody who has an interesting approach grounded in hard data. If somebody had a very large canopy chamber, that might be a really fun opportunity for us to handle some of that stable atmospheric condition evaluation. Next
Uh,
up was, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I would just say, Cole just asked a question about how we're tracking photosynthesis, and we are currently not in the current results, but wanted to know if he wanted to mention Tyler's plans for adding a PAR sensor in 2025.
Yep. Yeah, we have a number of pieces of hardware we want to add to it, including photosynthetically active radiation, some indicators of wind speed, things that will likely drive up the accuracy of the system significantly. And so, we kind of are testing out the minimally effective solution here with a lot of opportunity to improve accuracy through additional incremental hardware improvements and artificial intelligence improvements as well. The next question here is why is the range of NE so different across different sites? And so I'd love there, maybe to elaborate. When you say that, you mean the range of like while we saw different amounts of ecosystem exchange, the primary thing affecting that was that we're dealing with very different cropping systems and crops. The three crops we're looking at here were corn on various rotations, almonds and grapevines. And so, we see, seasonality, especially that, the corn is a voracious grower as an annual crop. We'll see, more canopy development in almonds across the summer, and grapevines are a little calmer and a very long-lived um, perennial crop. So a lot of that is what's driving those NE differences, that we went to deliberately very different crops and systems. Additionally, some of the cornfields were flood irrigated with oh, they were what were they called? Dairy manure effluent flood irrigated cornfields, I think is the full term for it, which is a fancy way of saying some of our folks had to go put on some boots and walk into a field full of manure. But that, that level of nutrient application and moisture drove really high levels of growth and also high levels of soil respiration of CO2. So again, the goal being how can we measure a lot of variation? So that covers that. Then next up here, we have a question. Do we look at how the R square would change if the relationship trend line would be forced through the origin? I don't know what that means. Kevin, I hope you do, but I hate to put you on the spot.
Apologies, I was researching another question, validating in our terminal. Sorry, what was the question?
Sure, no worries. The question is, did we look at how the R square would change if the relationship trend line would be forced through the origin?
We did not, but that is an interesting thing to track and try in our beta.
Yep. Well, so as we prepare for a scientific style publication, it's a great pointer. Thank you. So next up, we have Scott asking, how many acres will one tower measure? How do you place the device in the field? Rookie here, lol. I appreciate that context. So no, we don't consider our devices towers. They're at best a post, and that's a deliberate choice. These units are small. Their measurement footprint is square meters, not square acres, and that's a deliberate choice. What we do to make up for that, like first of all, it can be a huge advantage in strip trials to measure a small footprint because you can measure something that's a few rows wide with accuracy without having to worry about the effect of the next few rows over. But the other thing you can do is you can move them. So a device can easily cover many acres. When we're doing scientific work, our work on experimental farms or trials, often folks are putting a device out per a fraction of an acre so they can see how trial A versus B versus C versus control comes out. When customers are surveying larger pieces of land, devices can easily cover dozens or hundreds of acres with a little bit of movement to account for different soil types. It really depends on the cropping system and the terrain, and our sales team is happy to talk through those variables with folks to make sure we can size a project correctly. But one of the things we're also working on right now for release later this year is what we call flux mapping, which is guided movement of the devices across terrain to capture variation and to also capture relative time variance in fluxes to get a sense of how the overall terrain is varying flux in real time. And that'll be a neat way to see like what is the net ecosystem exchange on this sub part of the field versus the other part, high productivity versus low productivity. And we'll target that based around soil conditions, NDVI, and other indicators of variation. So let's see. Next, we have Art asking, how how do you monetize the value creation of your sensors? In other words, what do you see as an ROI? Do you convert the data in action driven information? So that's a great question. And what I'd emphasize here is that our customers typically are looking for ROI in a couple of key ways. First off, a lot of them are doing on-field trials that involve a lot of decision making with insufficient data. And so we're working with them to help them make better data guided decisions in the regenerative transition to be cost efficient. And so they'll go and say, hey, I'm looking to understand which of my regenerative trials is going to deliver the most value in soil health and carbon sequestration versus the cost. And so you can avoid a lot of cost in unneeded regenerative inputs or insufficiently effective practice with measurement. A lot of our customers are capturing value through telling their story with data for sustainability reporting and differentiating their products. And we're starting to work with some customers on carbon removal projects as well, creating a new asset class of performance monitored and measured carbon removal that's very different than the kind of traditional cross your fingers and pray and hope that in 5 years you'll see some change on soil carbon type approach to agricultural carbon removals today. Uh, Dr. Michael Schubenauer has raised his hand here, so I want to go ahead and give him a second to ask a question or help answer.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on the EC towers and the accuracy and some of the spikes that we're seeing there. So anybody who knows EC towers probably should know or does know that the EC towers are typically a sample of one across an entire integrated field. And there's still work to be done, I would say, to put that very mildly, in order to get reproducibility and accuracy of the EC towers to the level of what we're used from other sensoric systems. So the challenge here is that we're um, comparing one system that we're developing against another one, which we declare being the gold standard without actually knowing if it really is the gold standard or what the level of accuracy of the gold standard is at this point. And that is something where I would say we probably need to look at it with a degree of sensibility for inaccuracy on the EC tower side. So not everything that the EC tower reports or when the EC tower reports may actually be that way. And we're finding that out when we're putting, for instance, sensors that should be behaving and reporting the same thing, such as for CO2, such as we're taking a closed path and an open path sensor, and you put them side by side, you're going to start realizing that maybe the values you're generating in aggregate are not identical, and you may have a 5, 10, 20% error between the two. And then the question is, which one is correct? And in that sense, I would say that solid chambers are also needing to be validated against that, but we need to do that with a careful eye.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Our last webinar was on, cross-validating our devices with survey approached soil chambers. And that's part of our work towards understanding what our chamber effect is and how that's measuring our respiration measurements. And so there's a number of things we can do here to, advance the accuracy of the devices and then go back and improve our measurements along with the measurements going forward. But also, it's great to learn where the challenges are in the conventional approaches to measuring these fluxes, because it's a chance for us to figure out how can we overcome them. I forgot one really important ROI for our devices here in monetizing and value creation, and that is the fact that we are and we continue to be quite a bit cheaper than eddy covariance and a lot easier. So for folks who are doing research, for scientists and academics, the ROI for us is you can just get a much larger data set for the same amount of money. You can go to more sites, you can measure more locations on site, you can add on more measurements like, say, nitrous oxide flux, and that can be a really compelling thing, especially if you're looking at the alternative being you can't do eddy towers. Maybe you'll try and do some survey approaches with portable gas chambers, that kind of thing, or soil chambers. This is a lot easier. The data streams in, and we're excited to really help scientists scale the number of measurements they can do, especially on commercially active farms where deploying eddy towers would be too cost effective or operationally not really viable. So that's an important ROI I should certainly mention, and our scientific and research customers would be very upset if I didn't acknowledge them. Do we
Yeah, I'll just
have?
say when we to put it into perspective, when we go out and do an install, we can fit, literally dozens of these systems in a pickup truck and go out there and install them in a day, right?
Yeah.
So this just goes to show like how easy to install and how compact they are relative to other options.
Yeah. Yeah, we had sites where people are operating these and there's spraying equipment passing overhead. They're in the middle of a cornfield and they're operating well. We've had, we try and stay away from grape harvesters because they're particularly brutal and we don't want, a combine to pass over them. But they're, these you can take, we don't want people to destroy the equipment. Given the inherent low cost, you can take bigger risks to acquire data that's not possible with conventional towers that can be $75,000 or $150,000, and you're not gonna risk a tractor strike on a device like that. Nicholas Bombach had one other point here saying we have seen something different results based on network of 30 plus eddy covariance towers deployed for several years. Nick, if you're still here, I'd love for you to expand on that, please. I'll have to see on the attendee list. Perhaps he has left, but all right. We have another great question here from Cole Walton, and we'll see if Nick comes back. If we're training our EC data for NE, how is your footprint only a couple of meters? And the traditional approach for assessing footprint is based around sensor height. Our sensors are mounted fairly low for a variety of reasons, so we're assuming that our measurements are relatively small. But we're averaging. Our goal is to get a representative measurement across an area. So the larger footprints of an eddy tower, can provide some advantage in averaging across the land. But we don't want to say that our measurement in a specific portion of the canopy and with the soil sensor in a specific area is overly representative. But I should also highlight that's likely accounting for some of the variation of our measurements versus what we're seeing from eddy towers. All right, last call on questions, folks. Okay, thank you very much. We'll follow up with the paper itself and with everything else.